So, hello everyone. My name is Raven Manygoats, and I'm a curatorial assistant in the Art of the Americas and worked closely with Jean Quick-to-See-Smith on Indigenous Identities Here, Now, and Always, which is now on view at the Zimmerli Art Museum. I'm also a PhD candidate in the history department here at Rutgers, and my research focuses on the role of women within the history of the Red Power movement of the 1970s. Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which I stand on right now is part of the ancestral lands of the Lenape people who were forcibly removed and now live throughout the United States and Canada in diaspora, including the three federally recognized nations in Oklahoma and Wisconsin. They are the Delaware Tribe of Indians, Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We acknowledge that Rutgers University, like New Jersey and the United States as a nation, was founded upon the exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. While we should acknowledge the Lenape's experiences of historical and contemporary disenfranchisement, we should also recognize and celebrate their perseverance and survival. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and thank you to Michael Namingha especially for joining us for our virtual artist talk series in support of the ongoing exhibition, Indigenous Identities Here, Now, and Always. The Zimmerli's operations, exhibitions, and programs are funded in part by Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and income from the Avenir Endowment Fund and the Andrew W. Mellon Endowment Fund, among others. Additional support comes from the New Jersey State Council on the Arts, Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the donors, members, and friends of the museum. So Indigenous Identities was curated by Jean Quick-to-See-Smith, and it marks her largest curatorial endeavor, with over 100 artworks across a range of media, from beadwork and jewelry to video and painting. The exhibition foregrounds the significance of identity in art making through the diverse practices of 97 artists, representing more than 50 distinct nations from across North America. We are thrilled to have Michael join us this evening and to have his work in the exhibition. His piece, Altered Landscape 14, is on view in the land section of our main exhibition space. After Michael's discussion of his art practice, we will open up to questions from the audience, so feel free to put them in the Q&A function. So Michael Namingha was raised and currently lives and works in New Mexico. He graduated from Parsons School of Design in New York, and through his photography, Namingha merges realism and abstraction. His two-part Altered Landscape series documents the fire seasons of 2020 and 2022 in New Mexico. In 2020, the American West experienced one of the worst wildfire seasons on record, with a total of 8 million acres burned and 13,000 buildings destroyed at a cost of $2.7 billion. So we're lucky to have Michael join us this evening and talk more about his art practice. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Raven, and thank you all for joining tonight. I'm a little bit behind some of you, perhaps, because I'm currently in Santa Fe, so it is 5 o'clock here. I can start with my PowerPoint presentation. Let me just share my screen here. So before I get started, I just also want to thank Jean Quick-to-See-Smith for organizing this exhibition. I feel like it was, I don't know, 2 years ago that she had reached out to ask me to participate in this exhibition. And it was, Sunday afternoon, I received this email from her, and I was so excited to receive it. And we were able to send kind of correspondence back and forth about what she was interested in and what she wanted to put into this exhibition. And she said there was a particular work that she was very excited about. And I said, great, which piece is that? And she ended up never telling me. She said, no, I want you to select a piece for the exhibition. And so at the time, I had just completed this piece that you see here, Altered Landscape 14. And its sister piece is the piece that is behind me. And so during that period of this creation of this series, New Mexico was in the middle of two forest fires on either side of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so the blue sky piece behind me was looking east toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and then the Altered Landscape 14 was looking west at sunset toward Los Alamos. And so every day in Santa Fe, we were in the middle of both of these forest fires. But going back to Jean, I also just want to point out that she was such a champion for younger contemporary Native American artists, and I felt like she went on this journey with her career, and every time an opportunity arose, she said, "Not only am I going on this alone, but I'm bringing all of you with me." And I felt like when we went out for the exhibition opening at Zimmerli, it was truly a celebration of her life because she had passed away a week before. And I also want to point out how thankful I was for Neil Ambrose Smith, her son, for attending that opening and speaking to all of us that evening. I mean, I really hand it to him, having lost his mother just the week before. He made a beautiful presentation. And I also want to thank my fellow artists that were in the exhibition, are in the exhibition with me. It was such a great experience to see all of their work hanging next to each other, and some of the artists were there that evening, and it's always such a great opportunity to share space with them and to hear their stories and to talk about what it is that they're doing, how they got here. I think everyone had the same sort of description about Jean and how she was so inclusive. I'd like to also thank the Zimmerli Museum for hosting tonight and for allowing me to present my work to you all. So I'll get started with a little bit of history of my family and artistic roots. So my great grandmother was a Hopi potter by the name of Nampeo, and this is her work that you see here. This is an early pottery piece dated probably 1906, circa 1906. And it's representative of Chaco Canyon. The Hopi word for Chaco is actually Yupkoivi, which translates to the place beyond the horizon. Um, and this photograph that you see on the right is a photo that Edward Curtis took of her. I know he has kind of a controversial place in history, but I do feel very privileged to have this photograph of her that he took of her working on her pottery pieces. And so after my great grandmother, I come from a long line of pottery makers. My great grandmother, my grandmother, Dextra Quotzqueva, was also a pottery maker, and I have numerous cousins, and they are also all pottery makers. My father, Dan Namingha, is an artist, a painter, a sculptor, a printmaker. And so this painting here, Reservation Dusk, is also included in the Zimmerli exhibition. And um, it was wonderful to have my work hanging next to my father's in the land section of the exhibition. And this painting dates to 2008, and it's on loan from the Tewa art collection. Um, so this is kind of this is kind of a funny piece. So this was before I started at Parsons School of Design. I took 2 summers worth of master art classes in Santa Fe at a place called the Santa Fe Art Institute. And the Santa Fe Art Institute in the 90s would have these master classes. They were either a week or 2 weeks during the summer. And they would invite different artists from around the country to teach master classes with probably like 5 or 6 students. And so I was fresh out of high school. I think I may have even been in high school, but I signed up for some of these classes, and one of them was with John Baldessari. I also took a class with Fritz Scholder, Manuel Neary, Donald Lipsky, Judy Pfaff. Um, but with John Baldessari's class, this is a photograph of a work that I created during his class, and this is a acrylic collage on board, and it looking at it, I can identify like where some of my current art practice has its roots. These are photo collages that I had made using a Xerox machine. I had Xeroxed a photo of this Dalmatian dog, and I cut them up and collaged them onto this red painted background, acrylic on board. And so when it came time for the critique, I took my piece in to the studio and put it up on the easel. And John Baldessari had asked, why I chose this color red. And at the time, I, had a really just sad answer. And I said, oh, I just, like the color red. I thought it was so pretty. And he looked at me and he said, well, I think that's bullshit. You should always have a reason for the color you use in your work. And so that bit of advice stuck with me. And so looking at my art practice currently, whenever I include color in my work, it always has it has a meaning for it. Um, and so moving on to 2014, I was taking photographs of a sunset, a rainstorm in Galisteo, New Mexico. Galisteo is about 30 miles south of Santa Fe, and it's this beautiful, pristine, often photographed landscape. And um, so on my drive down to Galisteo to capture this sunset with this rainstorm, I noticed all of these signs along the side of the road that said no drilling in Galisteo, no oil in Lamy. Lamy is also near Galisteo. Um, and so I took the photographs. I didn't quite know what I was looking for other than a beautiful sunset. And so on my way back home, I still started to encounter some of those road signs. And when I got back to my studio, I started to do a little bit of research and look up what oil in Galisteo and drilling in Lamy meant. And I had discovered that for a long time, the village of Galisteo has been fighting with oil companies to protect the land that the oil companies wanted to extract resources from. And so I started to think about that landscape and this eradication and this removal. And so this block of green represents a piece of these landscapes that is being cut out, that is, will no longer be there. But I also started to research color psychology and what different colors, what kind of effect they have on people. And so green is a very calming color. And growing up in this landscape, I used to take these drives with my family out to, some of these remote areas. And I was always just I loved those experiences. I just loved being out in the landscape, and it was so peaceful, and it was there's a mindfulness that kind of comes with it. And so that's what I wanted that color to represent. And so throughout the series, they all had different colors related to calming effects on people. And there's also one that's kind of this hot pink. And when I was researching the use of pink, I found out that drunk tanks are often painted pink because it has this calming effect on people. And sometimes during a football game, the opposing team's locker room will be painted pink, so that it'll kind of calm down the players so they won't play as well. So I just became fascinated with color and what it represented. And so I started to really look at color in that perspective in my art practice going forward. And around that same time, I really liked exploring photography, but I was so used to seeing photography in squares and rectangles, and I became frustrated because I almost felt like I was hitting a wall with what you could do with photography. And so during that same time, I was living in New York. I live kind of between Santa Fe and New York, and so I was going to a lot of opera at the Metropolitan Opera. And of course, in Santa Fe, we have the Santa Fe Opera. And I started to observe how set designers often skew a set to trick the eye. Um, and so it piqued my interest, and I started to think about how could I take that same process and apply it to photography. And so I started to explore these shaped perspectives. Um, and it took a while to get to how this would actually function as, through experiments with cutting plexiglass, cutting the photographs, using Photoshop to manipulate the images to create these shapes. I don't know how many pieces of plexiglass we went through before we got to kind of like something that works, and also the process in how to create them. A lot of times, the plexiglass would crack. Um, but in the end, we finally developed a technique and it worked really well. And so this is a continuation of that Galileo Basin series. But now there's this very sharp, jagged um, shape going through the middle of the landscape, and it creates a much more dynamic effect. And it I guess from a perspective, like I wasn't also imagining the shadows of the work working the way that they do. As you can see, the piece behind me, it creates these sort of dramatic shadows depending on how you light the piece. So it gives it almost this added dimensionality. So oftentimes people will see these pieces and think they're three-dimensional, but it is truly just a flat piece and a flat surface. So these are digital chromogenic prints that are face mounted to shaped plexiglass. And after that, I started to um, explore other landscapes within New Mexico. And I had an exhibition at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum here in Santa Fe. And this is one of the pieces from that series. So the O'Keeffe Museum at that time had a program called Contemporary Voices, and they would invite a living artist to create a body of work in response to O'Keeffe's work. And so I started to explore Georgia O'Keeffe's Black Place series, which she created in the 1930s and 40s. And I worked with the curator, Carolyn Kastner, on that exhibition. And I was asking her, where is this Black Place landscape that O'Keeffe painted located? And she said, oh, it's in the Four Corners region of New Mexico. And so I started to look at that landscape, but from an aerial perspective provided by Google Earth. And so I really wanted to kind of get an overall view of how large an area that space is, where exactly is it located, how remote is it, all of these questions. And um, as I started to explore the landscape, I would zoom in and it looked like a bunch of parking lots. And so I thought, oh, maybe it's sort of like a park and like a natural park where you can explore or camp or whatever. Um, and Carolyn said, oh no, those aren't parking lots. Those are actually oil drilling pads. And I said, oh, okay. I hadn't realized that oil companies had moved into that area and had started to drill natural gas and do oil extraction. And so I started to do a lot more research on the area and discovered that in 2014, NASA discovered the largest methane gas cloud in North America sits over that region. And so it's this area here that you see in red, yellow, and orange in the Four Corners region. And so when it came time to photograph the landscape, I went out there with a drone because I still wanted to retain some of that aerial perspective that I was getting from looking at the landscape using Google Earth. And so at the time, this was 2017, um, drones had become sort of like this consumer technology that everyone was using. And so it allowed me to get up close and personal with this landscape without actually having to truly interact with it. And so I created these photographs utilizing drone photography. And so this is a photograph of Carolyn and I out there at the Black Place the day that I was shooting most of the footage for that exhibition. And so going back to this piece, that red that you see in the work is directly related to that methane gas cloud that you see in this image. So methane is an odorless, colorless gas that is really only detected using infrared technology. And when it does show up, it appears as red, orange, and yellow. And so a lot of those colors were incorporated into that Black Place series. Um, and then sort of a lot of times I think people are a little bit confused when they see my work on a computer screen. And so I wanted to share this little video of looking at one of my works from the Black Play series so you can see how it does sort of shift and morph and create this three-dimensionality out of something two-dimensional. So moving forward, I was in a program at the new museum in New York City called New Ink. It's, I think, the only artist incubator program affiliated with a museum in the country. And it's a year-long program. And I was there in 2018 and 2019. And I really did enjoy my time there. I learned a lot. I learned how to kind of like, I guess, present my work, because that's what they teach you how to do. But I was a little bit frustrated because so much of my art practice is based in New Mexico and the Southwest. And so I was in New York and I really couldn't quite connect with what I was trying to create at the time. And so um, this photograph was taken on May 31st, 2019. In Manhattan, there is this, I don't know if you want to call it a phenomena, but it's called Manhattan Henge. And it is during close to the summer solstice. It can occur toward the end of May, leading up to the summer solstice in June. And what happens is the sun ends up aligning perfectly on some of the larger avenues, so sort of like 23rd Street, 14th Street. If you stand in the middle of the street and look down, if you look west, the sun will kind of align perfectly between buildings. And so that evening, I was on my way to dinner and I noticed that all of these cars had stopped, taxis, and in this photo, you can see there's many people standing in the street taking a photo of the sun. And the sun was this crazy orange fireball, and it was enough to stop people in their tracks in New York, which actually takes a lot of effort. And so I took these photographs, and the next day at New Ink, we were talking about it. And what happened was there were forest fires in Canada, and the smoke had filtered its way down into Manhattan, creating these sunsets that were so intense. And so it really started to get me thinking about my own work and what I wanted to do. And so it was sort of that aha moment about why I was, what I wanted to accomplish while I was at New Ink. And so it all kind of came together by witnessing this sunset. And so um, when I came back to New Mexico, we were in the middle of our typical June forest fire season. And so this is the second part of my altered landscape series. There's three different series. This is the number two, but this is Altered Landscape 11. This is a forest fire that was burning near Los Alamos over the summer of 2021. And um, this was at sunset looking through the smoke. Um, and so it's been really interesting because living in New York part-time, but also living in Santa Fe, um, we're so used to these altered environments, that I think when it started to happen on the East Coast, it was so unusual for them to experience that. I remember after, I think it was in 2020, pretty recent in New York City when some of the forest fires from Canada were drifting down, and you had these skies that were these orange and yellow colors. But it became sort of a reason for me to start documenting what was happening in the West and why. And so then after that series, I moved into I wanted to take my photography practice to sort of another space. And so I started to explore silk screening. And at the time, I was asked to participate as a curator for the Grounded in Clay exhibition, that is touring right now. It's currently at the St. Louis Art Museum. It opened here in New Mexico at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, and then it went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And when it was at the Met in New York, I was asked by Patricia Norby to create a work for the exhibition specifically for the Met. And so I reached out at the time to Luther Davis, who is the master printer at Powerhouse Arts in Brooklyn. And this was just coming off the pandemic. So we were doing these kind of virtual talks about the project and what I wanted to do. And I wanted to bridge my family's artistic practices as pottery makers, so using earth materials tied to some of my photography works, and so incorporating sand into some of my silk screened photographs. And so this video was produced by Powerhouse Arts, and it talks about my silk screening process for that Met commission piece, but it also kind of gives you an idea of how I create some of my newer silk screened works. So here it is.
Hi, I'm Michael Namingha. I am an artist, photographer, now screen printer. Given my family's history with pottery making, I have been trying to think of a way to merge the two and to bring those two art forms together. For my work, I chose to do a silkscreen process rather than a straight-on photography process because I wanted to layer the piece with different inks. But more importantly, I've gathered sand from Santa Fe, New Mexico, whose Tewa name is Oge Oge, which translates to white shell water place. And for the Met piece, I wanted to use soil that was representative of where my people come from. Given my family's artistic heritage as pottery makers, and they gathered their clay from the earth and from a specific spot for decades. Last summer, I was also working with Luther up at the Anderson Ranch in Colorado. I had thrown this idea out to him and I said, I've been wanting to incorporate sand into my technique somehow. Is there a way that we can accomplish this task? And so we did some experiments, and that's when it just clicked. I'm pretty new to this. I did silk screening, I don't know, like 25 years ago. So working with a team like this that know exactly what they're doing, and even the color mixing process with Nellie has been great to be part of. And so there's all sorts of different levels because each person here seems to have knowledge of a specific area, and they can bring that knowledge to whatever I'm working on. And separate conversations lead to maybe how I'm thinking or looking at something differently, and they may see something else that I don't see. Being in this space and also working with a team of 5 people for at least a week's time is really eye-opening. I mean, I go home at night and I'm like, oh my God, I can't wait to go back to the studio.
So this is a continuation of that piece that was from the Met, and it's titled Chemehuevi 2. There are, I think, 4 of these in that series, and they incorporate the color pink to represent that methane gas cloud that still sits over that region. And I feel like with every administration, the protection around Chaco Canyon, Yugoivi changes. I read that I think it'll shrink yet again with the new administration. And so all of these, I feel like these landscapes are constantly in flux and we're constantly fighting for their protection. And all of it is just, it gets overwhelming sometimes. So this is a photographic work. I also started to explore different techniques of printing photographs. These are UV cured inks on collage dye bond panels. So the orange shape you see there is collaged on top of this solid green background, and there are three of these in the series so far. They're pretty large, they're like 60 by 60 inches. Again, I'm looking at that methane gas cloud as a source of color inspiration, but also at the air quality index color chart, because during a lot of these forest fires and environmental disasters, we're constantly looking at that air quality index chart and whether or not it's, the safety to explore, be outside and engage with the environment. I think when they had the fires in Pacific Palisades, some of those numbers were just so off the charts because of the materials that were being burned, all of these houses. And um, in forest fires here in New Mexico, that also, it happens. You just don't know what's in the air. Um, and so moving on, I started to document New Mexico's largest forest fire on record, which was in 2022, and it was the Hermit's Peak fire. And so we would get these, what they call pyrocumulonimbus clouds, um, every few days. So the fire burned, it started in April and it was finally contained in August of 2022. And so this large cloud, anvil-shaped cloud, would appear over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And it was this very sort of beautiful, puffy cloud that would show up in a normally like uh, bright blue sky. And so I began to document the course of this cloud's sort of formation over the course of the day. And so this was the cloud at the end of the day when it was at its most lethal and intense. And this suite of four large-scale canvases are the beginning of that cloud. And so when it was just peeking over the mountain. And so again, I'm exploring the air quality index chart in the colorations of each one of these clouds. The cloud with the blue sky is utilizing the CMYK silkscreen printing process, and then the other three, the silver, the red, and the peach, are I think each 5-color silk screens. And this piece can be hung in a quadrant. It can be hung, kind of on top of each other. This series is titled Disasters Series, and it is, in a sense, also a nod to Andy Warhol's disaster series of the 1960s, where he was exploring death and disaster and car crashes and tuna fish disasters. But in my work, I'm exploring the disasters within our environment, but using that same silk screening technique. And I guess I can start to wrap up. This is the last piece I created actually like 2 weeks ago at Powerhouse Arts in New York City. It's titled Disaster 8. It's part of that pyrocumulonimbus cloud. This is a photograph I took during that forest fire. And this is going to be in an exhibition at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum at the end of this year. It opens in November. The show is titled Tewa, and it's being uh, curated by the artist Jason Garcia from Winge here in New Mexico. And he invited Tewa artists of this area to create bodies of work in response to a quote that O'Keeffe made where she said that if she painted the pedernal enough times, that God would give it to her. And so in my work, I'm actually responding to a piece that O'Keeffe painted in 1945. That is one of her pelvis bone series. And in that painting, it incorporates these same colorations of red and yellow. But given a pyrocumulonimbus cloud's creation is either created by the intense heat of a forest fire, a volcanic eruption, or a nuclear explosion. And so, given O'Keeffe's painting dates to 1945, I wanted to explore New Mexico's history with the creation of the atomic bomb and also how it has affected a lot of our Puebloan communities downwind from Los Alamos, but also that O'Keeffe had a fallout shelter in her studio in Abiquiu built because she wanted to paint the landscape after a nuclear bomb detonation. And it's just a fascinating story. So I guess currently what's happening right now with my work, I have a show. I'm part of an exhibition along with Neil Ambrose Smith at the Albuquerque Museum that is exploring the light and space movement. That exhibit is up until July, and of course the Zimmerli is up until December. The Tewanange exhibit at the O'Keeffe Museum opens in November, and I will be beginning a fellowship at the Lunder Institute of American Art in September. And with that, I will conclude my presentation.
Thanks so much, Michael. That was great. Your work is so important. I mean, every time I'm walking through the galleries and I see your piece, I'm reminded of a couple summers ago when the wildfires from Canada, all the smoke was coming down into New York and New Jersey. And it makes me, reflect on the fact that more and more people are being impacted by forest fires. Um, so yeah, I think your work is very important. So thank you for sharing with us.
Thanks.
Um, I'm curious about how you decide on how to sort of distort the shapes of your photographs and like what that process is like and how you know, how that is.
Yeah, one thing about I think the shapes of my pieces, they are mimetic of pottery shards. And so I think when you look at pottery pieces and pottery shards in particular, you're looking at a piece of an overall stories because often pottery pieces tell a much larger story, and so a shard is just a small portion of that. And so these jagged edges are related to that. But the shapes themselves, what I do is I'll photograph a landscape and then I'll take that photo and load it into Photoshop. And that's where the distortion of these different shapes come into play, and also the different shading, how I want it to look, like the piece behind me, you can see there's different tonalities and opaqueness. It's transparent in some areas where you can see the underlying photograph using like the transparency tool, but also I'm obsessed with Rorschachs. And so often in my work, it is the mirror image of itself. And so when the viewer, I want the viewer also to explore something different in, because not everyone sees the same thing as in a Rorschach test.
Interesting. Cool. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A function. Um, I'm also curious if you're interested in exploring landscapes outside of, sort of the Four Corners region, or if there are any other sites that you're interested in looking at.
Yeah, I think part of the reason for looking at that particular landscape is it is part of my ancestral history. And so I always feel like there's authenticity in connection to particular landscapes. So sometimes exploring outside of that, I don't want to um, misrepresent, I guess, someone else's story. I have taken images when I was in Japan's my favorite country. I love just that landscape. And it is also so foreign to me, but um, I was much more interested when I was there in just how the architecture plays with the scale. I mean, it feels like Tokyo to me feels like New York City on steroids. I mean, it's just so your senses are on overload, and I love that experience. So other than what I've documented in New Mexico and Arizona, I guess Tokyo was the only other place that I've really explored in some of my photographs. There was a series I did in 2017 called Shibuya because there were photos I took when I was in Tokyo, Shibuya, Tokyo.
Have you done any artist residencies in Japan or sort of cultural artist exchange sort of things?
Not yet. I have a friend that always sends me one. She says, "You need to go. It's your favorite place." I said, "Yeah, I think I would like that. Maybe
Yeah,
I'll
that'd be
try
cool.
one."
Hopefully one day, maybe.
I did go as a UNESCO delegate in 2009, and that was a lot of fun. It was it was part of UNESCO and it was part of the Creative Cities network. And so they invited a bunch of artists and designers to work with university students from Japan, but also local artisans to create concepts to help the city of Nagoya design, um, uh, I guess, souvenirs, but souvenirs that were not necessarily like little trinkets, but something more rooted in the history of the city. And so we got to explore the city for 2 weeks and recording the history and then coming up with concepts and ideas for products that they could create and sell.
Hmm, cool. Sounds like a fun project.
Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned that you come from a long line of artists and how pottery sort of factors into your work a bit. Um, do you see your work in being in dialogue with your father's work? Or I also know your brother is a sculptor.
Yeah, my
Um,
brother is a sculptor as well.
do you see, is there dialogue between the three of you in your work, do you think, or do you kind of keep it separate?
Yeah, we have been exhibited together. So my father, my dad opened a gallery in 1990. It's celebrating its 35th year this month. Um, and so my dad and my mom opened it in May of 1990 to represent or show just my father's work because he had been represented by two art dealers and just, I think wanted to take control of his market, his career. Um, and so they opened this gallery to show his work. And then throughout the years, in 1994, Alan Hauser, he's a sculptor, he passed away. And so his sons created the Alan Hauser estate. And so they asked my parents if, because my dad and Alan Hauser had exhibited in the 1970s and 80s together with the same gallery, they had asked if my parents would represent their father's estate. And so they did. And so after that, I think in 1996, Fritz Scholder um, asked my parents if they would represent his work. And so it was my dad, Fritz Scholder, and Alan Hauser, I think up until about 2000. And then it went back to the Hausers opened their own gallery, which is good. And then Fritz, I think, um, I don't know who represented Fritz at that time, but anyways, then my brother became an artist, and so he joined the gallery. And then when I came back from Parsons, I also became an artist, and so I started exhibiting there. And so our work is shown together in that space, and so there is a connection or a line between all of our work. My brother does very sort of minimal stone sculptures, but he also works in bronze and sometimes stone and bronze and wood. And then my father, of course, is a painter, a printmaker, and also a sculptor. And then, I have my photography silk screening process. And we've been exhibited in other museums together as well. I mean, at the Zimmerli, my dad and my work are hanging next to each other. So
Mhm.
there is a very easy, relatable conversation between the work, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I think I also saw the Grounded in Clay when it was at the Met, and your dad's work were close by to each other, if not side by side as well. And yeah, it was great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Um, and then Lynn, one of our participants, said thank you for this wonderful presentation. So thank you, Michael. We really appreciate it. I think that concludes our talk for the evening. Our next virtual artist talk will be with Cara Romero on June 9th. So you guys can check out our website for more details. Thank you again, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.